London, the mid-1960s. A city alive with change. The Beatles on the radio, miniskirts in Carnaby Street. A sense of youth and freedom sweeping through Britain. Yet beneath this new optimism, something dark stirred in the industrial shadows of West London. Between 1964 and 1965, a series of murders shocked the capital. Women, all of them working in one particular trade, were found dead, stripped, strangled, and discarded near the River Thames or the dim alleyways of Hammersmith and Chiswick. The press called the killer Jack the Stripper, a name echoing London's most infamous murderer nearly 80 years earlier. What followed was one of Scotland Yard's largest investigations, a desperate manhunt through the city's underbelly. The killer was never found. This is the story of the Hammersmith Nude Murders, a tale of mystery, misogyny, and murder in swinging London. Welcome to Echoes of the Unknown, where we dive deep into the unsolved, the unexplained, and the downright unbelievable. My name is James, and today we're looking at the case of Jack the Stripper, the lesser known of London's two Jacks, but potentially more deadly than his more infamous namesake. If you like these kind of mysteries and true crime stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. For now, it's time to travel back to the swinging 60s, as we delve into the puzzling and horrifying acts of Jack. To understand the creeping terror that enveloped West London in the 1960s, one must first look back to the darker corners of the city's past. In 1888, the East End had been convulsed by the terrifying spree of Jack the Ripper, who murdered at least 5 women working the streets of Whitechapel. His identity remains a mystery, yet his legacy became a grim benchmark for the worst that could happen in London's hidden night zones. That crime wave left an imprint not only on the public imagination, but on police procedure and urban folklore. Fast forward to the 1960s, and England's capital was undergoing a cultural transformation. The swinging 60s brought music, clothes, optimism, yet this veneer of modernity coexisted with vast social invisibility. In areas such as Hammersmith, Chiswick, Acton or Brentford, along the river corridor of the Thames, industrial estates, boatyards and neglected riverbanks formed a quiet labyrinth by night. Prostitution in this period was illegal and largely unmanaged. Women who sold sex did so in precarious circumstances. Unlicensed flats, cars pulled off towpaths, streets deserted after midnight. Many were poor, displaced or addicted, and social attitudes were harsh, both inside the police and the wider society. The law viewed them as offenders or nuisances, not as vulnerable people deserving protection. The result was that thousands of encounters were invisible, unregistered, and unguarded. In this landscape, the riverbanks of the Thames offered a sinister backdrop. Long hours, low light, fog drifting off the water, and the occasional car idle by a towpath. It was here that the anonymity of the city merged with the isolation of its outskirts. When the first body was discovered, naked, strangled, and abandoned, few truly grasped that this was no isolated crime, but the start of a pattern. A parallel to Jack the Ripper was invoked by the press almost immediately, a killer targeting women working the night trades, leaving their bodies exposed and evading capture. But whereas the Ripper's victims were murdered in 1888's East End, these killings took place in the 1960s West London. The city's bustle by day offered little sign of what was happening at night. The very modernity of London masked the avenues of predation in the dark. An industrial decline crept in and factories closed or shifted. Empty warehouses and abandoned sheds became dumping grounds. With police stretched and forensic science lagging, the conditions for a predator were quietly aligned. Isolated victims, unsupervised spaces, and a city that preferred to look away. The thread of this case begins not perfectly at its core, but with earlier violent deaths that investigators later linked by pattern and proximity. In fact, on 17th of June 1959, 21-year-old Elizabeth Figg was found dead on scrubland at Duke's Meadows, Chiswick, near the River Thames. Her dress was torn open at the waist, her bra perhaps dislodged, her underwear and shoes missing. Pathologists concluded that she'd been strangled and dumped between midnight and 2 a.m. that morning. Although at the time her death was treated separately, in retrospect it shares the hallmarks of what was to follow. Next came on the 8th of November 1963, when 22-year-old Gwyneth Rees was found at a refuse disposal site in Mortlake, less than half a mile from the Thames towpath. She was naked except for one stocking, which stopped just above the ankle, and was found accidentally decapitated by a council shovel. The cause of death was recorded as strangulation with a ligature. Investigators later noted that several of her teeth were missing. Although officially not one of the 6 core victims, many criminologists now include her in the series. The series, as officially recognised, began on the 2nd of February 1964, when 30-year-old Hannah Tailforth was found on the river foreshore below Linden House, near Hammersmith Bridge. Her body was naked, her underwear had been stuffed into her mouth, and several of her teeth were missing. Trace evidence suggested she entered the Thames about 24 hours before discovery. She was also pregnant at the time of her death. Initially, her death was treated as suicide, delaying the linkage. Just over 2 months later, on 8th of April 1964, 26-year-old Irene Lockwood was found floating face down in the Thames at Corney Reach, Chiswick. She was naked also, strangled and pregnant, 2 victims in a row with that same tragic detail. Petite stature, she was only 5 foot tall, made her vulnerable, and operatives noted that once again no sign of forced entry or a struggle was apparent. The public response forced police to declare a serial killer at large. In late April, on 24th of April 1964, 22-year-old Helen Bartholomew was discovered in a dark alley behind 199 Boston Manor Road, Brentford. She also was naked, strangled, and the first key forensic clue appeared. Flecks of industrial spray paint were found on her body. Investigators believed this hinted the killer worked in an environment coated with fine airborne paint particles, perhaps a vehicle spray booth or industrial site. Then, in July, 30-year-old Mary Fleming was found lying outside 48 Berrymead Road, Chiswick. She too was naked, had missing teeth and paint flecks adhered to her skin. Neighbours reported hearing a car reverse and then speed away some minutes before the discovery. The use of a vehicle thus entered into the investigative picture. Later that year, on 25th of November 1964, 20-year-old Margaret McGowan was found in an alleyway car park on Horton Street, Kensington. She had previously testified at the trial in the Porfumo affair, raising speculation of connections to high society. Though the location was more affluent than others, the same pattern of nude dumping, missing teeth, and industrial paint was found. Finally, on 16th of February 1965, 25-year-old Bridget Birdie O'Hara was found behind the Heron Trading Estate, Acton, in a storage shed area. Missing underwear, signs of a storage in a warm environment, and paint flecks which matched a nearby electrical transformer site were all key investigative leads. And then it stopped. The abrupt end of the murders after early 1965 puzzles authorities to this day. Did the killer die? Was he imprisoned for another crime? Or simply stopped because he feared detection? The consequences were profound. 6, possibly up to 8 women, sex workers exploited by society, were lost, and the police assembled one of the largest manhunts in their history. The victim profiles revealed chilling consistencies. All women working in the sex trade, all found nude or nearly so, many with missing teeth or signs of gagging, industrial paint flecks on many of the bodies, vehicles heard near dump sites and disposal sites in or by the Thames or near industrial estates. Yet despite these patterns, no prosecution followed, and no definitive cause for the cessation of killings has ever emerged. When John De Rose of Scotland Yard was assigned the case in early 1965, he inherited the largest investigation in the Metropolitan Police Service's peacetime history. The task was monumental, hundreds of officers, thousands of statements, and an anxious public demanding answers. De Rose and his team recognised that the scale of the killer's activity was not merely local, it threatened the reputation of the entire force. Investigators interviewed more than 7,000 men as potential suspects. They patrolled riverbanks, used decoy prostitutes to catch customers, blocked off towpaths after dark, and examined every motor vehicle track near the disposal zones. The riverfront, warehouses, garages and boatyards became crime scene after crime scene. The detective energy was immense, the pressure from the media and public relentless. One of the major breakthroughs came when flecks of paint found on the bodies was traced to the Heron Trading Estate in Acton, an industrial complex of warehouses and spray painting workshops. Analysts immersed themselves in matching paint technologies. One batch of paint matched that found on O'Hara's body and near a concealed electrical transformer in the estate. This line of inquiry gave the investigators the only physical lead that seemed to tie the victims to a location. Yet for every advance there were obstacles. Many victims had used aliases, had travelled, had been missing for days. Often their last clients or routes were unrecorded. Evidence degraded, no DNA testing existed, and witness memories grew stale. Social status of the victims created further difficulty. Sex workers were considered at risk rather than priority victims. A daughter of one victim later said that police were not looking for someone who looked like a monster, they were looking for someone who would hurt a prostitute. DeRose made bold public statements. At the spring 1965 press conference, he declared the suspect list had been whittled to 20 men, then 10, and then to 3. After the announcement, the killings ceased, but no arrests were ever made. Some believe the killer heard the message and stopped. Others, that he died or left the country. Although modern crime scene techniques were rudimentary in the 1960s, this investigation still pioneered new methods. Geographic profiling of dump sites, paint matching forensic techniques, use of night shift decoy operations. Later academic work used computer models to plot dump site data and concluded the killer likely lived or worked around Chiswick High Road or Hammersmith. Yet in the end, the file remains open, the killer never identified. The lost bodies, the missing evidence, the overlooked lives of the victims, they all converge into one of Britain's most haunting unsolved cases. In that sense, the investigation itself became part of the story, a massive hunt, a dramatic public theatre, and then silence. As the murders stopped abruptly in 1965, speculation about the killer's identity became an obsession for both the police and the public. Theories multiplied and names surfaced from every corner of society, from obscure factory workers to celebrities and even law enforcement officers. Each possibility reflected not only the evidence, but also the anxieties and the prejudices of the time. For investigators, the case was maddening. Chief Superintendent John DeRose had become tantalisingly close to naming his suspect, but with no physical proof, his hands were tied. Over the years, several figures emerged as potential culprits, and perhaps none more sensationally than the national hero turned nightclub owner, Freddie Mills. Freddie Mills was one of Britain's most beloved sportsmen. A rugged light heavyweight boxing champion, he'd fought his way to fame in the late 1940s and become a household name. He was cheerful, approachable and patriotic, the working class hero who embodied post-war British spirit. After retiring from boxing, he reinvented himself as a nightclub owner and television personality, often appearing in light entertainment shows. By the 1960s, Mills was part of the London celebrity circuit, rubbing shoulders with singers, actors, and gangsters alike. But beneath the charm there were whispers of debt, depression, and darker associations. Mills' club, the Night Spot, located in Soho, drew a mix of performers, mobsters, and sex workers. The Cray twins, notorious East End gangsters, were rumoured to have frequented it. The club world of Soho was murky, a place where entertainment overlapped with extortion, where police corruption and organised crime existed side by side. When the Hammersmith Murders dominated headlines, Mills' name was nowhere near the investigation, but that changed after his shocking death in July 1965. He was found in his car outside his club, shot in the head with a rifle. The official verdict was suicide, but the details were strange. The gun was wedged awkwardly between his knees. There was conflicting reports about whether he could have physically fired it himself. The bullet trajectory seemed unusual. Some friends insisted he'd been cheerful earlier that day. Others whispered that he was terrified in the weeks before his death. Rumours exploded. Within days, tabloids began connecting his death to the Jack the Stripper killings. Some claimed he'd been about to be arrested. Others said that he had confessed to a friend. Popular urban legend emerged that Freddie Mills had been leading a double life, a charming public figure by day and a sadistic killer by night. But where did this story come from? Most historians trace it to police leaks and sensationalist journalism. Mills had been under financial strain. There were allegations that he had borrowed money from underworld figures connected to the vice trade. Some officers allegedly viewed him as sexually deviant, a vague label in the 1960s that could mean anything from non-conformity to something genuinely criminal. When he died, coincidence of timing just months after the last known murder seemed too perfect for conspiracy theories to resist. But the hard evidence simply isn't there. No known link connects Mills to the victims, to the West London industrial sites where bodies were found, or to the paint traces that became the case's forensic signature. He was a public man, often surrounded by others, rarely alone for long stretches. To commit these murders in secret would have required careful planning, private space, and a level of cunning that did not match his public persona. Still, the story stuck, partly because Mills' death felt suspicious, and partly because the media loved the symmetry, the national hero hiding a monstrous secret. It became the stuff of late-night whispers, true crime books, and sensationalist documentaries. In 2001, a Channel 4 programme revived the claims, quoting unnamed sources and suggesting the police had quietly believed Mills was the killer. Yet every official statement from Scotland Yard has denied this, and DeRose himself, the man closest to the case, never confirmed the rumour. The Freddie Mills theory endures not because it's proven, but because it symbolises the strange intersection of fame, fear, and moral panic that defined 1960s London. Before Mills' name entered the frame, police had already dealt with a false confession. In April 1964, a quiet caretaker named Kenneth Archibald walked into Notting Hill Police Station and told officers he had murdered Irene Lockwood. His confession was brief and vague. He seemed tired, confused, and deeply unhappy. When detectives pressed for details, his story fell apart. He couldn't describe where or how he had killed her, and physical evidence immediately contradicted him. Archibald was charged nonetheless. Desperate detectives hoped for closure, but the case collapsed in court. He was acquitted after the jury deliberated for less than 15 minutes. Later, it was revealed that Archibald had been suffering from depression and alcoholism, and may have sought notoriety or punishment rather than justice. His false confession embarrassed the police and deepened the mystery. The real killer was still at large, and now the investigation had lost credibility in the public eye. Of all the serious suspects, one name has persisted, that of Mungo Ireland, a night watchman working near the heron trading estate in Acton, the site linking most strongly to the final murder, that of Bridget Birdie O'Hara. Ireland was a married man from Scotland, described by colleagues as quiet but moody, with a military background and access to vehicles. He worked in close proximity to the exact type of electrical transformer unit that had produced the same paint flecks found on multiple victims. When investigators learned this, suspicion fell heavily on him. But before he could be interrogated in depth, Ireland was found dead in his garage in March 1965, poisoned by carbon monoxide from his car exhaust. He left a brief note addressed to his wife, apologising for the trouble I would cause. Chief Superintendent DeRose later claimed, obliquely, that the killings had stopped because the murderer was no longer with us. When pressed years later, DeRose confirmed that his prime suspect had indeed taken his own life, though he never named him. Many have since concluded that he was referring to Ireland. Supporters of this theory point to the circumstantial evidence, the proximity to the crime scene, the timing of his death, the ending of the murders, and the psychological profile, a man possibly struggling with guilt and isolation. Critics, however, note that no forensic proof ever tied Ireland to any victim, and his wife swore that he was innocent, insisting that his suicide was motivated by unrelated personal issues. Still, the coincidence remains striking. If any single suspect fits the pattern of opportunity, location and timing, then it's Mungo Ireland. Over the decades, the Hammersmith Nude Murders have inspired theories far beyond the official investigation. Some believe the killer was a policeman, someone with the authority to stop women on the street without raising suspicion. Prostitutes were known to distrust the police, but they also knew them well. Some accepted protection or favours in exchange for silence. A killer within the force would have had both the knowledge of investigative methods and the confidence to operate undetected. However, no officer was ever publicly named, and this theory remains speculative. Another theory links the murders to the Profumo affair, the 1963 political sex scandal that toppled a government and shocked Britain's establishment. One of the victims, Margaret McGowan, had reportedly testified during the inquiry into that scandal, using her alias Frances Brown. This connection gave rise to conspiracy theories suggesting she, and perhaps others, had been silenced. In this version of the story, Jack the Stripper was no random killer, but a hired hand, disposing of women who knew too much about elite sexual circles. Yet historians widely dismiss this notion as fantasy. No credible evidence ties the Profumo case to the Hammersmith murders. A more grounded theory centres on London's underworld and vice trade. During the early 60s, prostitution and pornography flourished in the shadows of Soho. Pimps, gangsters and small-time racketeers controlled much of it, and the women who worked those streets often knew dangerous men. Some investigators believe the killer may have been part of this criminal network, perhaps someone who felt disrespected or betrayed by the victims. Others thought he might have been a client whose violent fantasies escalated to murder. The brutality and ritualized stripping of the bodies suggests not just opportunistic violence, but compulsion, possibly a man with deep resentment towards women or sexual guilt rooted in trauma. Scotland Yard's behavioural analysts, rudimentary by today's standards, describe the killer as likely male, aged between 30 and 40, physically strong, familiar with West London, and employed in manual or industrial work. The precision with which he disposed of the body suggested planning, and the lack of sexual assault pointed towards control and humiliation rather than sexual gratification. Modern criminologists who have revisited the case often describe Jack the Stripper as a sexual sadist without overt sexual expression, someone who derived power and release from domination and degradation rather than the act itself. The stripping of the victims, the removal of teeth, and the insertion of underwear into mouths were symbols of silencing and dehumanization. There's also evidence that the killer adapted. Early victims were dumped in rivers, where evidence washed away. Later ones were placed in back streets and alleys, as if the killer were growing bolder or taunting the police. The final murders, their distinctive paint traces, hint that the killer had grown careless or desperate, perhaps under mounting pressure. This aligns with the idea that he was someone whose professional or personal life was beginning to collapse, like a factory worker facing exposure or a security guard whose world was narrowing around him. In the end, none of the theories can be proven. Freddie Mills remains the most infamous suspect because his story touches the nerve of national mythology, the fall of a public hero. Mungo Ireland remains the most credible, fitting the geography and timeline. The others, the policeman, the underworld enforcer, the silencer of secrets, belong to the fog of London legend. Chief Superintendent DeRose retired, convinced he had known the killer's identity. "We had him," he said years later, "but we couldn't prove it." The official file stayed open, its pages thick with interviews, photographs, and unanswered questions. When true crime authors revisited the case in later decades, they found not closure, but a haunting pattern, a society that ignored the vulnerable, and a police force overburdened by class bias, and also a media more fascinated by the killer's mythology than by the woman that he killed. The truth may never surface, but each suspect, each theory, tells us something about the fears and fantasies of the time, the distrust of the authority, the corruption of fame, and the fragility of respectability in a city forever haunted by its shadows. The chilling saga of the Hammersmith Nude Murders has steadily found its place in true crime culture, even if it does not dominate headlines like some other serial cases. The press-coined name, Jack the Stripper, evokes not only horror, but the echo of Jack the Ripper, reinforcing London's enduring fascination with unknown killers who prey on the vulnerable. Books, films and podcasts have explored the case repeatedly. Authors such as Robin Girossi and others have revisited the crime scenes, the victims and the investigation, seeking fresh insight decades later. One of the major non-fiction works is Jack the Stripper, the Hammersmith Nude Murders. Fiction has also drawn inspiration. A horror film, The Fiend from 1972, features a misogynistic killer whose modus operandi echoes the dumping of nude bodies across London. Music too nodded to the case. The band Black Sabbath referenced Jack the Stripper in one of their early US releases, illustrating how the case seeped into the 1970s counterculture. Beyond entertainment, the case has entered discussions about policing, victim status, and the disappearance of sex workers' rights. It stands as a cultural mirror, how society treated its most marginalised, how fear spreads in quiet neighbourhoods, and how some crimes become symbolic of systematic failure. For true crime audiences, the enduring mystery, why no one was caught, adds the final layer of fascination and condemnation. Hammersmith Nude Murders stand today as a stain on London's criminal history. A killer moved quietly through the city's night, targeting those least able to protect themselves, using industrial corridors, riverbanks and garages as hiding places for tragedy. Even after the largest manhunt of its time, the case closed only in paper, but not in justice. The story is more than a horror of murder. It reflects the vulnerabilities of women forced by circumstance into the margins, a law enforcement system that did not prioritise them, and a society that denied them dignity in life and in death. Their names, Hannah, Irene, Helen, Mary, Margaret, Birdie, should not be hidden by the killer's appellation, nor buried underneath sensational headlines. In the dark night of 1960s London, a predator operated and vanished. His identity may remain unknown. The record remains: 6 or more lives taken, a community terrorised, and an investigation that faltered at the edge of ambition. For us, the archive files, the faded press photographs, and the cold dump sites are silent witnesses. They remind us that unsolved does not mean forgotten. And although the killer escaped justice, his victims did not escape memory. The case of Jack the Stripper may be closed for the police. For the public, it remains an open wound, and a cautionary tale about how society treats its most vulnerable. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Echoes of the Unknown, London's lesser-known Jack, but maybe more terrifying. Lots to think about with this one. Definitely brings to mind the later Yorkshire Ripper case. I personally think the only thing that stopped the killings from escalating further was that the murderer himself passed. I think the Freddie Mills theory is too much of a stretch, though, and merely coincidence. What do you think? Put your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you again. If you enjoyed this one, then there's plenty more frightening and chilling stories coming up, and a few in the old back catalogue, so make sure to check them out. Remember to like and subscribe and all that good stuff. I'll be back next time with another case, so until that time, stay safe, and remember, keep listening for the echoes.